everybody for coming, as always. Today we're going to hear from Dr. Chris Stone, who is Dr. Holly Tuten's husband. I also almost called him her wife somehow. So.
It's the 21st century.
Right. So, in addition to being her husband, he is also an entomologist and ecologist, currently working on a postdoc in the Department of Statistics here at NC State with Dr. Kevin Gross. They are working on models of insect vector-borne diseases and the evolution of insecticide resistance. Today, this is a follow-up to the trip report that Holly gave last week. And this will be about the interactions between invasive plants and malaria vectors to get us started on the discussion that Holly and Chris will lead for us today. So with that, oh, and just as a reminder, if you see my finger, that means 2 minutes. If you see my hand, it means 3 minutes. Wrap up your comments. And that, please, Chris, Dr. Stone. Oh, and also, guys, we're being recorded for Frank Close, who could not be here today. I will only be sharing the video with him. So. But yeah, so keep it clean, keep it, you know.
We videotape it, everybody.
Right there.
Well, thanks, Lois. So this is going to be a really brief presentation just to sort of get us into the topic, hopefully. So my background and my interest in this started a while ago during my PhD when I looked at nectar feeding by mosquitoes, or sort of plant feeding in general, and seeing how that would affect malaria transmission or vectorial capacity of mosquitoes. And so this follows up on that workshop that Holly talked about last week, which I hope everyone here attended. So
of course.
Yeah. And the link there was to see, is there anything particular about invasive plant species and their relation to vectors? And that wasn't at all clear to Holly or I when we went to that workshop, and it's perhaps still not really clear if there's anything general that would make invasive plants different from the perspective of vectors or not. And I hope that this discussion could sort of help brighten that a little bit and see, is there anything there, or is that just every plant's going to be a case-by-case situation, or are there sort of generalities we can get at looking at traits or impacts of invasive plants? So really briefly, just to give some insight into the relation to plants that mosquitoes have. So I'm talking about malaria mosquitoes mostly here, because that was the focus of this workshop. But this would apply more broadly to most mosquitoes, actually. So they use a number of sources of sugar. They'll use floral nectar. Here's a female Anopheles gambi, the Malaria mosquitona, Lantana. Extra floral nectar is very commonly used. Honeydew is a very common source. You might feed on damaged fruits or seed pods or things like that as well. Some people think they might pierce plants and get at phloem. That's still a bit controversial. And it's essentially just an immediate source of energy for them. So they use it to boost up their energetic reserves, their lipid and glycogen reserves, and as an immediate substrate for flight, so they can actually keep flying if they run out of energy. Otherwise, they rely on blood, of course, to develop batches of eggs. So they use those two resources. And the males entirely rely on sugar. They don't feed on blood, so they're pretty useless without the sugar meal. So if they want to mate with females, they really need to take these nectar meals. So there's a very tight relation there. So this is a drawing from a paper by Ferguson and others. It's a bit confusing perhaps, but if people are very unfamiliar with the mosquito life cycle, I thought I might quickly go over it, and we can talk about that in more detail if questions come up. Just to give an idea of where interactions with plants might happen. So we develop the larval stages develop in aquatic habitats, typically sort of temporary rain puddles or fairly shallow ephemeral pools. Plants around there might form cues that mosquitoes use to find suitable habitats. Leaves might fall in the water and affect the quality of the habitats in some way. When you think about aquatic weeds, obviously they can have an impact. Mosquitoes then typically, after they emerge, they rest in the vegetation. They might take a sugar meal then, so sugar feeding is very common immediately after emergence here. So then mating happens, and then after that you get all this complicated blood feeding cycle. So mosquitoes will look for hosts, usually humans or cattle or something in the vicinity of humans. When we talk about malaria mosquitoes, if they're successful, they rest for 2 or 3 days, digest the blood and develop their eggs. And And there's all these helpful arrows here that they put in there saying at any given time they might be resting on or feeding on nectar, and it's lots of question marks. We don't really understand it all that well or when they really do it, but it's at least plausible that they feed on sugar at all those times throughout the cycle. So this was already on that handout that everyone might have or not. So these were just some traits of plants that I could imagine might affect mosquitoes. There might be better examples. You guys might have other things, but things like the amount of nectar production or the composition of the sugars of the nectar, secondary metabolites present in it, volatile organic compounds that are produced by the plants that might aid mosquitoes in finding or locating certain plants or preferring certain plants over others. And in addition to the nectar, you can really think of plants as providing nesting sites. So the amount of ground cover, what are the implications for the microhabitat that mosquitoes rest in? To think about seasonality. So this was actually one of the mechanisms that people brought up at this workshop, was actually one of the only ones that I could think of, was that invasive plants might tend to stay greener longer into the dry season. And if that's the case, that might actually help mosquito populations avert a crash for a bit longer. So that could have an impact. That seems like a possible mechanism. I don't know how much there is to that idea or not. And then we could think about the effects that plants might have on animal communities, other invertebrates, the diversity of plants, vertebrate hosts, so blood hosts. Just think about the abundance and the diversity of all those and how those might interact with mosquitoes. What we're really interested in getting at, though, is seeing if there's any kind of generality. So if you think about what demographic or life history traits makes plants invasive, is there anything? So there was one paper Holly sent out that mentioned things like the short juvenile period or smaller seed mass. Maybe there are more relevant traits, or maybe there are others. And do those in any kind of predictable way interact with those traits that might affect mosquitoes, such as nectar production or the impact on aphids or anything? And maybe it'd be more useful to think also about the typical ecosystem impacts of these invasive plants. Again, there was another paper that was sent out that suggested typically there might be an increase in overall plant production, but a decrease in animal abundance, for instance. If you think about sort of typical impacts that you see with invasive plants, could we sort of make a plausible link to a way that that would affect mosquito populations in terms of their abundance or their longevity or their biting frequency? So really briefly, a couple of plants that we know mosquitoes interact with or that they will get nectar from, and these are some that I've used in the lab myself, and things like Ricinus communis, Lantana camara, Parthenium hysterophorus are quite relevant. Senna is a number of Senna species that mosquitoes seem to be quite attracted to and get a lot of nectar from. The current one that people who are sort of following up on that workshop are really interested in or see as something that's possibly relevant across larger scales is Prosopis, or several Prosopis species. So Juliflora would be one option. We could also think of aquatic weeds like water hyacinth. And with that, I thought we'd just go into a more informal discussion.
Yeah, so I think also, it's important when we're thinking about these. So all of the plants that he just showed are invasive plants that people are already associating with potential increase in malaria incidence. The workshop was very much focused on malaria, although Chris and I think that this is widely applicable potentially to many different vector-borne diseases, those transmitted by mosquitoes and others. For instance, biting flies in general have a long, intimate, historical relationship with sugar, with plants. Like Chris mentioned, with rotting fruit, with honeydew, with nectar, but then also using plants for refuge, protection from desiccation, protection from the cold. He mentioned that when they emerge, you have the teneral adult. That just basically means they're still kind of soft. And it's a very vulnerable point in their life, and they need a place where they can harden up before they fly out into the environment. So creeping ground cover would be quite good for that, right? So we're trying to take a holistic approach to this, to where mosquitoes might interact. So it's not just nectar. There's been a pretty tight-knit but very dedicated community working on nectar for about 15, 20 years now. Woody really started it. But there are other things we can think about. How could invasive plants alter the aquatic habitat? We know that in some cases, you'll see aquatic plants making areas that weren't accessible to mosquito breeding accessible now. For instance, they wouldn't normally breed on the edge of a lake shore that didn't have any aquatic vegetation because the water moves too much. It laps against the shore. But when you have really dense water hyacinth crowding the shore there, then they get this buffer from water movement, and all of a sudden that becomes a place where they can breed. Where we were at for the workshop, it was really interesting. We were right on the shore of Lake Naivasha, and walking down to the shore and looking, you know, I saw a shore that had been invaded by water hyacinth. So it had altered the breeding habitat right there. And then immediately off the shore, there was Senna, there was Ricinus, there was Prosopis, all right there. So if you think about it, before any of these plants had invaded, it might not have been a very good habitat for mosquitoes. But after this invasion, particularly when you look at the synergistic effects of several different invaders, you do have an environment where malaria transmitting mosquitoes might be able to proliferate. So I think couching that in that kind of holistic perspective is going to be important. There's not going to be an easy way to nail this down, and Chris and I both think that the invasive part of this is kind of an implied hypothesis that should be tested first. And we're hoping you could help us suss that out.
A question. In the plants that kind of are a hindrance to mosquitoes, how does that, what's the mechanism for that? Like some plants you plant and mosquitoes don't like.
Yeah, like there's actually an invader, what is it called? Mosquito fern? I can't remember the
Azolla.
Azolla, yeah. And it completely crowds the water surface. So this is one that you know, it's going to be change the environmental structure, right? It's an environmental engineer, and it completely crowds the water surface. And mosquitoes can't breathe underwater. They actually have a breathing tube, the larvae. They have to come up to the surface, and they don't have a plastron. Younger ones can stay under longer just through diffusion. But when the water fern, when Azolla covers the surface, those larvae can't come up. So yes, you know, this was something that came up at the workshop too. And this is why it might be a case-by-case basis, because what if you have, and this is why we also think it's very important to kind of test this implied hypothesis. What if you have plants that invade and then reduce the incidence of malaria, right? And one
control.
well,
There's an area about control. I'm thinking habitat manipulation. I mean, it's an area about control that you're usually trying to bring in good folks, but this is.
yeah, and there were some experts in weeds biocontrol at this workshop. People in South America who worked on these kind of large scale releasing insects in order to eat the weeds biocontrol. So they're already, you know, floating ideas about that. You know, yeah, maybe we'll find out that there's a plant that if it proliferates, we see a sharp reduction in malaria.
Yeah,
Right?
trap cropping or something. I mean, these are
Mhm.
ideas that have been used in agriculture.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I'm actually working on a review paper about that. Something different. Yeah. So any thoughts in general? Anybody? Questions, thoughts?
So like you mentioned plant that kind of completely covers the water surface and prevents like the larvae from getting a proper respiration, right? So like, does that affect the diversity of the other invertebrates in the water? And like, so if you're using something like that for biocontrol, the impact on non-targets would be severe, right? So
You know more about it, like if we kind of narrow the focus down to malaria, right? You know more about the anomaly habitat.
I don't think anyone would be thinking of bringing in water hyacinth or anything like that as a form of plant. I think it's more the other way around. It's like there's people who are interested in controlling or dealing with these invasives, and then there's people interested in dealing with malaria, and it seems that there are areas where there might be opportunities to work together, or actually there might be opportunities where there is a conflict of interest. So for instance, there's this nice example of in Tanzania, people are, apparently the Ministry of Health is now promoting that people plant Lantana camara in their backyard as a way, because they think it repels mosquitoes. And some other people are kind of aghast at that and thinking.
This isn't like the top 10 invaders in the world. Like Lantana is.
Right. So ideally, I guess the idea would be if you can show that if you could make the point that invasive plants generally would increase malaria, then you can make an argument that you could sort of do something about it, invasive weed control, and that would be beneficial for malaria control as well, or you could maybe marry those two attempts in some way. But if there's no generality whatsoever, if this plant has a beneficial effect on malaria and this plant has a negative effect, then
It has to be done on a case by case.
then it becomes very complicated, and you probably do end up with conflicts of interest.
So are they looking at native plants that might have some control impact on the mosquitoes, where they could enhance native species? I mean, I know you're looking at invasive species, but if you can't use the invasive species because you don't want them to be invasive, what about, there must be some natural plants that also have an impact.
So, I think at this point, what they're focused on is in particular cavity. To be blunt about this, probably the creation of this workshop was cavity invasive species really cares about the African farmer. And there are several species of invasive plants that are absolutely devastating to farmers' lives. Either they have toxins, like Parthenium, that can cause very bad allergic dermatitis in people, or it's a nettle that causes massive swelling in cattle when it eats it. And these invasive plants are coming in to land that in many cases has been wrestled from the wild with blood, sweat, and tears and farmed for a few generations now. And these invasive plants are coming in and they're driving people off their land. This bothers people at Cabby a lot, right? They're on the ground and they see how this ruins people's lives. Unfortunately, as our esteemed colleague here will tell you, there's not a lot of money for invasive weeds control, right? And so to be quite blunt about this, they realized that if they could indicate an association between an invasive weed and an increase in the incidence of malaria, then they could tap into, for instance, Gates funding in order. So this is much less about using plants to control mosquito populations and much more about using malaria as a vehicle to fund invasive weeds control, right? And this is one reason why Chris and I, from the very start of the workshop, coming in as vector ecologists, felt like this was an implied hypothesis that something, why is it invasive plants that would have an effect, right? That's what we're really trying to nail down. We're trying to nail down if there are any global characters of invasive plants that would always have, you know, a positive effect.
But I mean, you were talking specifically about vectors of malaria, right?
In this case, yeah.
So one of the things you'd want to put down there from what you just said would be how it modifies the habitat, right? Because you say hyacinths make the water slow down and builds up the population, and the other one comes in and actually doesn't allow the mosquito.
Oh, right.
So you would want to be looking at how it's modifying the habitat.
So yeah, I guess a global character would be an environmental engineer, but then at a lower level, it would be what is it doing?
It would be the degree to how it does the engineering.
Right. Yeah.
And something I in grad school, part of my project was habitat manipulation for great crops. So, you know, and back that's the whole like, let's plant plants and the good bugs come in and eat all the bad bugs. And biology being as crazy as it is, that it is not that straightforward. And so we planted a couple species of plants and had much worse pest pressure because the pests are getting the nectar resources too. So it's not that easy. But one thing, you know, that you could hone in on here, he said that the mosquitoes do, you know, they need the nectar and they're looking for the nectar. And something we saw is, you know, not every flower is created equal. I mean, you've got different mouth parts of different types of insects that are able to access different types of flowers. So that may be one part of it for you is what do the flowers look like and which ones can they access?
Roger?
So one of the most interesting things from the seminar last week, besides the diversity of shoes, in fact, I learned a lot more by looking at slides than if I'd actually gone to Kenya. But I thought it was fascinating the history of like the weed eradication in the US. That was something that I was not aware of, and it seems like here you're wrestling with like trying to know which of these factors are the most important. So if you have like a small amount of resource, which of these plants or weeds might be the most critical to attack, or so which of these traits are most important. I was wondering if there's any, because I think you said that a lot of the people at that conference didn't even know that history of that weed eradication in the US. I was wondering if there's a case for like looking at histories of past eradications of malaria or other vector-borne diseases and see how frequently, if there's any evidence for other types of weed eradication, especially water weeds, and seeing if that correlates with success or failure in malaria eradication campaigns.
I kept bringing this up in the workshop, and I was just like, do you hear the words that are coming out of my mouth?
Yeah, so definitely, I haven't had a chance to look back at the literature. I was actually wondering if anybody in this room might be familiar with something like that. But just kind of these, we know that weed eradication was a big part of eradicating malaria from the United States. Massive weed eradication efforts. And because it altered the lake shores, basically. And in this case, it didn't alter it so it made it more likely to breed. It was that they could not disperse larvicides effectively at the lake shore without removing the weed first, right? Are there any other accidental experiments like this, right? Like, for instance, is there a clearinghouse of massive weed biocontrol where we could just like go and look and say, there have been massive, weed biocontrol successful efforts, here in Brazil in the 60s or something, and then that would give us a starting point to look and see if there were changes in the incidence of vector-borne disease at those times?
I don't know, but there is a book in our library about weed biocontrol that came out not too long ago, a year or two. I think the Forest Service was or Department of Interior was the main agency behind it.
Is it global or is it?
Don't know.
The safest for Collins Lab works on that specifically, so we have some good context.
Anybody in the room, like any major weed biocontrol efforts, especially in tropical areas that pop to mind?
I think there has to be, but I don't know that. But I mean, that's usually one of the best control stories. There are success stories. It's usually for weed.
Seems like after Bob's presentation about how kind of loaded the word invasive is, that just to have a hypothesis that invasive plants increase malaria just seems out of hand.
I completely agree.
And it's about the characteristic of the plant. You could say something like aquatic plants increase malaria or something like that, but just to say invasive plants, it seems bogus. Just start.
Or about, what about, for instance, nectar-bearing qualities of invasive
like
plants?
that.
I mean,
But it's,
what is it like, or
Sugar
is,
content was also important, right?
Hmm?
You said the sugar content was also important. Composition of the sugar was important. Do you know which sugars the vector prefers, the mosquito prefers?
There's actually not a ton of evidence that it matters a lot. whether
Okay.
it's, The secondary metabolites, things like those might actually have an impact.
toxins,
Yeah.
right? So is that like something that you see in invasive plants? Do you ever see any, is there an overexpression of toxins or secondary metabolites, or
Well,
do they have to get pollinated? So do they, or are they better at kind of like self-propagating? Are there any kind of global characters like that predict invasiveness in weeds?
no, there are no global characteristics. Herbert Baker in the 60s proposed a list of traits associated with weeds, but this was for rural and agricultural weeds. And you see they tend to be self-pollinated, they're wind-pollinated. But you're talking about invasive weeds, so I'm thinking more environmental type weeds rather than agricultural weeds. But Parthenium is an agricultural weed, so.
And Cabby cares about agricultural weeds.
That's
quite
right,
obviously,
of course,
right?
of
Yeah.
course. So sort of keep that in mind, that there's sort of a separation between weed science, classical weed science, which is really focused on plants, bad plants in agriculture, and invasive plant science, which focuses more on bad plants in natural and disturbed systems, right? And the factors affecting which plants become weedy/invasive is going to depend what kind of system you're talking about. I wouldn't expect grasses necessarily. Grasses are wind pollinated. They're not going to have nectar necessarily, right? unless they're trying to attract ants through extrafloral nectar. So grasses may not have a pattern. And I know when I mention grasses, because there's a big amount of literature on invasive grasses, C4 grasses, right? Certainly invaders of natural areas, forest, shrubland, likely they'll have rely on dispersal agents because those systems aren't going to be as widely disturbed by people. You're not going to have cars going in and out moving seeds on tires, so they're going to rely on animals for dispersal. So you're going to have probably factors related to pollination and fruit dispersal are going to be more important. So it all depends, I guess, what kind of system you're talking about.
So are there any global characteristics for invasive plants of aquatic environments? Like if you narrowed it down to that.
But the aquatic is only impacting the breeding, right? So where, I mean, how far will they leave from the water source to go get nectar? I mean, are they
If you think about sort of the main malaria mosquito, it actually lives in very close proximity to human houses. It often rests indoors, it might fly out with it. In some of the villages in Kenya that I'm familiar with, people might have nice concrete water holes next to their house that they use to build their house, and they'd often keep them. And mosquitoes lay their eggs there, so they can just fly. They barely have to fly at all. They can just go into the yard, lay their eggs, and fly back again. And they might take a sugar meal from something that's in the direct vicinity of the house. So I think, yeah, think of villages or cities or roadsides or places where humans are. So I guess you are thinking about disturbed areas mostly because we're talking about
Like disturbance specialists or urban invaders.
I think we're thinking about malaria mosquitoes, which are, the reason they're so dangerous or why they're such good vectors is because they are so closely associated with humans. So that's the kind of environment that I think would be most relevant to, at least to malaria. To other diseases, that would not necessarily be the case, right? So yeah, something like water hyacinth, it might have an impact on the shores of Lake Victoria, but that's probably a minor area for malaria mosquitoes where they breed anyway, because they'll just breed in rain puddles or temporary.
Coke cans.
Not in small containers.
Mm-hmm. So buckets.
Right. So if there are sort of invasive weeds or things that you would associate with disturbed habitats or with areas of high human use, I think we can narrow in on that and see if those have general characteristics.
Are there, well, so for instance, are there any invasive weeds that disturb, the soil in such a way that you might see ruts or ditches or, puddles?
The soil?
Yeah, I mean,
Or capture.
capture, like,
There's some plants that might have little areas where they collect water.
they're axles, and there are mosquitoes that breed in the axils of plants, but I don't think anopheles do.
A different way to think about it would probably be that the phenology of those species is different, which then causes either more standing litter, higher decomposition of the litter, which might increase humidity, affect humidity some way, that also might attract earthworm activity. So in that way it might affect the habitat, the microhabitat.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't necessarily say it
Structural
disturbs.
changes.
Yeah.
I guess I'm still confused about what you're trying to do. Like, are you, like what Sean was saying, do we even want to go forward with this hypothesis of just trying to disprove invasives make malaria worse, invasives make malaria better?
Yeah.
Or do you want to instead take the top 30 plants that are invasive that are in this area and just start looking at each of those as far as
Another thing I kept saying, I was falling on deaf
instead of this all or
ears.
nothing, it's going to be very
Right.
hard to prove. And
Yeah.
you're probably going to get a very mixed.
Just start with the simple table of
Be like,
pollinators and how they could
Yes or
affect the
no?
mosquito life cycle, right? Yeah, I agree, but it was kind of, the way we were thinking about this was, let's kind of go ahead and really suss out whether there are any potential global characters, of invaders. And if there are not, that basically excludes the hypothesis right there.
I guess, yeah, why
Sounds like you
are we
might already be
caring about the hypothesis? If they're really doing it to get
Well,
money for
because there are
research-
some people who are still quite stuck on this. And the thing is, if you think about it, if they just start targeting invasive weeds, and with the hypothesis that reduction in invasive weeds will cause a reduction in malaria, then that's basically an uncontrolled human experiment right there. And we could, in some cases, potentially see an increase in malaria.
I mean, that's what I think would make more sense if you just look at a few, and if you already think, you know, Lantana's already doing this, and we want to get rid of Lantana anyway, be like, well, let's start with that one.
Except some people now are telling people to plant Lantana because apparently it repels mosquitoes. Even though
it here, but I don't like it in the tropics.
Even though the evidence indicates that it's not, that mosquitoes take, that malaria transmitting mosquitoes take nectar from Lantana.
One characteristic of invasive plants, to me, that would say that they might increase malaria is just to have plants where there were no plants before. Like a large part of Africa that I've seen is totally red dirt with no plants at all, because everybody takes every single plant and they burn it or whatever. So if there's simply plants where there was before only red dirt, then that would be it.
So yeah, your hypothesis is just plants. Does the presence of plants, I mean.
And invasive plants may be able to survive in this hard packed dirt where
Because
there
they
was
get
no
disturbed
plant.
side.
This is the
Right.
disturbance specialist
Yeah.
here, right? Yeah. Or maybe plants that, you know, are good at coming in
Primary
after fire.
colonizers,
Right.
plants that you bring into a new area that are primary colonizers.
I would,
It is.
It's painting
Plant.
me.
I agree. It pained me all week. Nobody wanted to hear me at the end of the week.
That's what they agreed to go home.
it sounds like we just need a lot more basic field research to figure out what environmental characteristics will affect the distribution and availability of abundance of mosquitoes, right? I cannot think of any major characteristics of invasive plants. You know, some have nectar, some don't, they're just all different. But the one thing, though, that might be important is that they all, the truly invasive ones, change the structure of the habitat in a very significant and obvious way. So whereas most natural native ecosystems may have a more even diversity of species, you would expect an invader to dominate it. And in so doing, it is going to change the physical properties of the microenvironment that may or may not favor the mosquitoes. So the change may be more obvious.
So is that one thing that you see with urban invaders, you know, or disturbance specialists in weeds? Like, do you see, is it almost always followed by, you know, a drop in invertebrate diversity, or a drop in vertebrate diversity, or a drop in plant diversity? I mean, is there anything typical like that? Because if there's a drop in plant diversity, then there might actually be a drop in overall nectar levels, right? So are there any characteristics that are typically associated with weed invasions like
Well,
that?
that's a funny thing, is that despite everyone saying invasive plants reduce biodiversity, there aren't that many solid ecological studies demonstrating it. Is it truly the invasive plants reducing it, or is it some other factor that's reducing it?
Or is the invasive plant just, you know,
Takes advantage.
up on the bandwagon?
That's
like
right,
that?
takes the advantage of it. So, but the general consensus among managers is, you know, you see an invasive plant and you tend to see less diversity because this area is dominated by that plant. So the cause and effect is still a question, but I think most people would agree that the really bad plants reduce the diversity, directly or indirectly.
And I saw something at the Annapolis meeting a couple years ago. I think the guy was from University of Delaware that pretty much showed that he did have a previous study showing the impact of the trophic levels above. So it wasn't really plant on plant. It was, I think he looked at like a lot of invasives in the U.S. and showed that in those areas you had less invertebrates. You know, you had less, because a lot of, you know, if you think of moth caterpillars, a lot of them are very specific. So if you didn't have some of those native hosts around, you were having less caterpillars, but then there was less birds because they were feeding those to their babies and stuff. So it was, try to find that if you're interested. It was a couple years ago, but it was very kind of earth-shattering for me.
Yeah, also because, you know, there are invertebrate predators of mosquito larvae in aquatic habitats, right? So this is one mechanism where you might hypothesize you would see an increase if if there's a loss of those predators,
Oh,
then,
yeah.
you know,
Birds, I mean, not birds. But
no, it would just mainly
Other
be
insects.
invertebrate predators, yeah. But then not with malaria, but with some other diseases like West Nile virus, for instance, where you do have amplification in animal reservoirs or maintenance in animal reservoirs, potential effects on vertebrate diversity could impact the disease transmission, right? If you lose all your birds, you're not really going to see West Nile spilling over into people. So it does, I think, matter, maybe not specifically for this case, but in terms of just thinking about an invasive.
But for malaria, I think if your diversity of animals decreases, I would assume you end up with mostly humans in that case. Maybe humans and humans, rather than then more of the bites could be on humans, and your malaria transmission increases as a result of a lower diversity.
Right, so what Chris is saying is you don't necessarily have the amplification reservoirs for malaria, right, in animals, but it's just that if you have less, this is an idea known as zoo prophylaxis. If you have less animals that the mosquitoes could be diverted to for their blood meal, there's going to be a higher biting pressure on humans. So,
Outside of vertebrates as vectors, or not vectors, but reservoirs, what about, how important are fish in aquatic systems as far as controlling mosquito larvae?
the highly invasive Gambusia affinis is important. Yeah, I mean, mosquito fish are very effective. I think, yeah, I mean, fish definitely predate on mosquito larvae.
Still water.
In still water, yeah. Yeah, so you're not going to see, I mean, it's just not going to matter.
Mosquito fish in a potted plant and you're in business.
Yes, okay, absolutely.
So they're not
Put them in a stream and.
Or canal,
invasive fish.
a canal, irrigation ditches, you know, you'll definitely see those effects there too.
There's actually a Cochrane review recently on Gambusia and the effect on vectors, and they found no evidence whatsoever that they had an impact.
Really?
Yeah.
You're supposed to tell me these things.
So, I'll just jump in and say in Hawaii, they released mosquito fish and other live-bearing fish for mosquito control just massively all over the place, and canals and streams and everything. And they've been to Hawaii, they've got lots of mosquitoes. I mean, the fish.
But maybe less than they would have.
The fish wind up in streams where they do really well, eating other stuff.
All right.
And the mosquitoes continue to not be in streams.
Right. Yeah, and you know, and then there are other effects in terms of the invertebrate diversity too. Like there are Gregorine parasites that can cause a reduction in mosquito populations, and they have an intermediate host in like copepods in these aquatic habitats. So if you see a reduction in invertebrate biodiversity, you might. Whereas mosquitoes, especially, and this is where I think we might have some confluence with the invasive weed mosquito thing, not just malaria, is it might be that the mosquitoes that are highly invasive, there are mosquitoes that are also disturbance specialists, right? They might be particularly good at kind of following those invasive weeds in, right? So if you see a weed come in and cause a reduction in macroinvertebrate diversity or something like that, maybe this is a habitat where a lot of invertebrates wouldn't be able to eke out a living, but these invasive mosquitoes tend to be particularly good at, either because of behavioral plasticity, physiological plasticity, they can come into these depauperate environments and thrive as well, right? So for me, actually, I think that might potentially, if there's some kind of global patterns in what happens after weeds invade, then that might also set a precedent for thinking about this. But again, I'm very new to the invasive plant literature, so I just don't know. Right?
So are they following similar pathways? I mean, you're talking about one following the other?
But what I'm saying is there are some mosquito species that either they can exploit a large range of environments, right? So they're not environmental specialists, and those are very good invaders, right? Or they're particularly good at thriving in depauperate environments, right? Like
The one that has malaria, which is it?
Anopheles.
Or maybe you don't know.
I don't know. How would you describe it? It's so specialized.
Yeah, I mean, just the malaria mosquito, it's got such an intimate relationship with people that I mean, I would say that there are very few mosquito species that we would call anthropophilic, right? Like human loving or human adapted, and this is one of them.
So it's specialized, but we happen to be everywhere, so it is too.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems like it can also survive without nectar. It can just survive on blood, which is not true for most mosquito species. It's just that nectar makes it a better vector.
No, the males survive.
Hmm?
The males don't drink blood.
They don't, right.
You have to have some.
Oh, sorry, I'm talking about the females.
Without
Yes,
the
yes.
present, does it-
This has actually been a big part of Chris's work. Males matter.
I mean, in the lab,
You want also-
experiments maybe show that, but showing that happens.
What, Chris?
Yeah, repeat that.
I was just wondering, so with the whole males needing nectar, if you have less nectar available, do you see drop in males? Do you see drop in malaria all the way through? But that's
Take it away, Maestro.
Yeah, there's just no field evidence for it at this point. It's just in the lab, sure.
What were you seeing in the mesocosms?
Well, then it's very simple. And then the population crashes if you remove plants or nectar,
And it because of a crash in males.
probably.
Is there another tech? Is there for predatory mosquitoes that have toxin-kinase that the larvae kill the other larvae? So whatever is increasing the Anopheles habitat would also increase their habitat.
Is Toxo there?
Do they have it?
Yeah, I think so.
There's a lot of density dependence with Toxo, I think.
So you think the more Anopheles, the better.
The thing again about Anopheles, they have this thing
There
where
might be carrying capacity of the.
they really prefer laying their eggs in these temporary pools. And the idea is that they do that to escape predation. So that 10 days later, before predators really find that particular site, they might already have their own developed already. So I'm not actually sure how important I mean, in rice fields or so, or in more stable habitats, predation would be really important, but not across the board.
Yeah, and
Predation is so important, and they cut out the weeds that slowed down the water. There was no predation going on in those lakes.
they weren't looking at that in Tennessee. Tennessee work was just basically aimed at broadcasting larvicides.
And those are also fairly new lakes too.
Yeah, they were man-made lakes that were a problem. Yeah, it was man-made lakes and what was it? The
Tennessee Valley Authority built those lakes.
European milfoil was the invader, the weed that was preventing distribution of the larvicide. Yeah, so again, we controlled it before by controlling invasive weeds, but I don't see any global patterns there.
So it sounds like we kind of are all in agreement that focusing on just invasive plants is not, I don't know, just not productive. Yeah, it's just not productive. So it would probably be best to focus in on, or I focus in on identifying certain characteristics of the invasive plants that are having an impact on mosquito populations, really real mosquito populations. So far we talked about nectar being a benefit, but I see one of your example hypotheses was mosquitoes infected with malaria agents self-medicate with nectar, thereby causing a reduction in malaria. Explain what that, so there's a potential that increased nectar could also decrease malaria?
I think people have speculated about it. For instance, with Parthenium, there have been some experiments where the idea is that this Plasmodium would be negatively affected by Parthenium, so the metabolite that might be produced, or that is produced by Parthenium.
Because keep in mind, mosquito is infected with Plasmodium too. The mosquito has malaria also. It's not just a mechanical vector. There is an obligate developmental stage in the mosquito. So a mosquito is not, for instance, not going to transmit Plasmodium until about day 12. It takes a blood meal, and then the Plasmodium develops in the mosquito. It has health effects on the mosquito as well. And the mosquito has to live to day 12 to transmit it.
So they're suffering as well.
Well, there might be an impetus there to self-medicate if that's a possibility, right?
But it's only very specific plants that have the secondary contaminants.
I mean, it just hasn't been studied very well. I think And I know with Parthenium, other people have done the same studies and they've sort of found an opposite effect. So they actually found that mosquitoes developed higher numbers of sporozoites when they were feeding on Parthenium. So it's,
But it also looks like there might be different subpopulations of Parthenium and that they might be expressing different, secondary metabolites as well. So that's kind of complex there. I want to go and look into pharmaceutical screening databases and see if they've already looked at secondary metabolites that might be found in invasive weeds and if any of those are candidates for malaria treatment, right? I mean, we've been looking at alternative drugs for malaria for 20 years, right? So why can't we look at databases and find out if there already are secondary metabolites that would be present in invasive weeds that do cause mortality in Plasmodium.
Bill and Melinda might be able to buy their way into this database. There's a lot of information. Get Bill and Melinda to buy it.
So are there many field studies evaluating the individual plants going on right now instead of just this big global concept? Because there can be so many different things at play besides just the nectar.
So Gunther started in Molly? Has he already started with Prosopis?
sounds like it, yeah. I wouldn't say there are many going on.
No. There's a graduate student that's approached Chris and I about helping him design something. Teo is looking at Prosopis too? Yeah. So just a couple.
It's going to be hard because you're going to have just that plant.
It's incredibly hard. Yeah, I mean, so Teo's with Cabby. So he's a PhD student with Cabby, invasive species. And his original project was just going to be looking at the kind of the status of this invasive plant in these different areas and its phenology. But now he wants to add a mosquito component. So he wants to add measurements of some aspect of the mosquito population dynamics or the incidence of Plasmodium or so I think the willingness is there, the money might be there. We'll probably see more of these starting up, but not a lot has been done. I mean, this is a really new idea. Basically, this is why we're trying to right now, before we all go ahead and make huge mistakes and just start eradicating invasive weeds.
Or planting.
Or planting them, yeah.
You mentioned population variation within the plant. What about within the mosquitoes? Is there variation?
In terms of resistance to Plasmodium
Or
or
everything that might be
how the plant metabolites affect them?
I'm just saying, I don't know if you know how varied the populations are, if there's variation at all.
I guess the difficulty is that lots of this work has just been done in labs in the US with some colony of mosquitoes that has been kept in cages for 10 to 20 years.
And may have been selected for certain traits.
Presumably, we don't really know. But I mean, actually, yeah. Right, so how different are mosquito populations in Kenya? Very different from Tanzania in terms of their behavior or their ecology? It's really difficult to say anything sensible about that.
Could you
And then,
something about just looking at some of the genes to see how much variations in the genes, something could be easily done in the lab before you look at behavior. To see if there's even a possibility of a behavioral difference.
I mean, they seem to have a pretty classic genome as far as being resistant to things and change their behavior when people do things.
Oh, do they? Okay.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, just in general. And then we don't, another thing that I've wondered about is, what kind of tools exist for identifying plants based on nectar composition or anything like that? Are there?
This has been done, because this has been done a lot for agricultural.
Yeah,
exactly. I mean, I don't know if y'all tapped into that literature, but there's probably 40 years worth
of identifying plants based on
nectar. So what I'm seeing is, what I saw with it was if I was going to go further along the research I did was looking at, I was going to try to identify what you have here, the main pest I was concerned about, and then try to find flowers that were good for that one, and also not to plant things that, or not to give the pest additional resources, and then to give your beneficials more. So there should be, so that's going to be for ag pests, but there should be information on many plants as far as how their nectar is available, what floral structures are like, and that sort of thing.
Well, because like one thing I wondered is, going back to behavioral plasticity, is could we sample mosquitoes? Could we sample sugar-fed mosquitoes out of the environment and then identify the plants that they're using based on crop contents, something like that? Right?
Can that
Which,
be done?
huh?
Can that be done? I mean, like, can you parse it out if they have multiple, or like various different nectars in the same crop? Can it be
How
parsed
much,
out?
how much DNA of the plants captured in the?
I would just tint them in with Lantana, tint them in with another one, and like
Which was done.
look at, look
Yeah,
at them
but, I mean-
afterwards, see if that they were,
That was his PhD, but. Yeah.
keep doing that.
It's done.
So are there, so it sounds like ecosystem impacts might be, if there's anything to this, that's where you want to look, right?
The ecosystem impacts following
Yeah.
invasion.
Maybe not just nectar either, but like one major resource that is not plastic for the mosquito or for the plant is water. Right, water availability, it affects malaria prevalence. So you're kind of killing two birds with one stone there. And that water availability is going to affect your agriculture. So if you can change irrigation systems, which is what the World Health Organization says actually reduces malaria, it's like the biggest impact on malaria is changing irrigation systems. So if you can change the water availability or resource either through irrigation or even just like I know they do fountains to disturb the surface of the water so mosquitoes can't lay their eggs there.
Yeah, but Cabby won't get their money that way. That's the problem.
But if they're doing it to improve crop systems, so let's say that they want to change irrigation systems for crop systems,
So that there are less weeds?
so that there are less.
Is that
So
done?
that there is less prevalence of malaria and potentially less.
And they can see the
weeds.
impact of that change on weeds.
But Cabby just wants to get rid of the weeds. Like, has altering irrigation ever had an impact on weeds? How?
I mean,
Because like seeds that are born on irrigation water or something like
I don't
that?
think there has to be something like that. I mean, start in the eastern United States where we get all this rain, and then go out west where they don't get rain. There's no, it's a
Right,
different.
it's through irrigation or something like that.
I'm sure there's information out there on that. I'm not familiar with it, but I'm sure.
Well, are there a lot of these weeds growing along like open irrigation canals where if it was a contained irrigation system, it would
Well, we know
mitigate
we,
that?
I know we know weeds can clog irrigation systems. That's an attribute of something we don't want is if a weed is clogging an irrigation system. So I don't know what the impact would be on malaria.
But also weed seeds, small weed seeds will get around in
You're
fields,
talking
in
about them
between, and
you're
among
talking about
fields.
being distributed.
Yeah.
Either by water or wind.
Yeah,
If those are aquatic weeds, they may not survive in a dry environment though, where you might have a crop planted, like wheat or corn.
Yeah, but the irrigation canals, they will survive there.
So the BTI, like, you said BTI, right, like for controlling mosquitoes, like, so that's a dispersion of BTI is affected by, like, say, dense mat of weeds. Is there any evidence of?
I mean, again, aquatic weeds, maybe?
Yeah, aquatic weeds.
yeah, it does, yeah. Yeah. It absolutely can, yeah, and there is evidence of that with BTI as well.
So when you say introduce weeds comes in, explosive production, dense mat of weeds, and the impeding the control of mosquitoes, that's one way to look at it, right? Like,
Yeah, and that was what was going on in Tennessee when we eradicated malaria from the US. That's exactly what was happening. There was a weed that was clogging the lake shore. And in lakes that did not have the weeds, they were able to apply these broad spectrum insect larvicides, right? They weren't using BTI then, but probably something that poisoned everything in the local area. But then when the weeds were there, it reduced efficacy of the larvicide. The larvicide couldn't be distributed in the environment. So there would be an application that you would count on is kind of getting dispersed, but if there are weeds, there's an application that doesn't get any further than that mat of weeds. And BTI acts that way as well. Yeah.
but there's no evidence that, like, say that, like, introduced weeds would be more impeding the dispersion, say explosive reproduction and taking over habitat.
Actually, I have examples of both,
Mhm.
where if you cut off the surface, so the mosquitoes couldn't get air, right? And that
Then
was-
you see a reduction.
As opposed to one that just stilled the water and gave them a better habitat.
Well, we're nearing the end, so Holly and Chris, if there's any questions or anything else you'd like to ask the group, any summary statement?
Well, actually, I mean, I think we've sussed out a couple things, actually. I think the environmental engineering is a really big one. Whether it's, you know, before or after the fact. And irrigation, I think that there might actually be something there. Like I'm definitely going to, one of the directions I'm going to be looking in is whether irrigation systems facilitate the movement of agricultural weeds in these parts of Africa, because he's right, we do know that some irrigation can facilitate the incidence of malaria. And then also nectar, kind of looking back in the agricultural literature. And yes, some people have found DNA. I don't know. Do you want to talk about this? The fluorescence microscopy? I mean, did they actually successfully have run PCR on it?
It seems like it's, yeah, so the idea would be that small particles of cellulose end up in the mosquito gut, and that would be sufficient to identify the plant they're feeding on.
Using like a gene-based blast or something, right?
And it seems like at the meeting, other people were claiming that they were having success with the same method, so it actually seems to.
So yeah, we might be able to amplify DNA from the crop, right? Sorry, Betsy.
It's okay.
So if anybody has any further questions for Holly or Chris, they can contact me via email.
Or if you know, there's a publication you really think we need to see, or if you have an awesome hypothesis that we can take to Bill and Melinda and get you $1 million to investigate it.
Zika virus.
Huh?
Zika virus.
Oh, yeah, obviously, yeah, Zika virus. That's all we've got to say. Just subject, body, Zika, 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 Zika babies, Zika, Zika, Zika babies. Give me money. Hey, thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody.
One,
Thank you.
consider contacting Rob Emmons. He is aquatic weed and specialist in North Carolina here. He may have additional ideas.
So it's,
So
everyone's
Rob Emmons.
Yes.
He's also currently the water resources of the North Carolina Basin.
Oh, great.
But I expect his role will be changing in 2 weeks.
Yeah, you know, because also I would absolutely love it if we could. I would really like it if we could draw on the horizon.
There's one more
Right.
person I have to get to sign off on.
Because I think maybe in the malaria system,
Three kids that are probably.